The life-altering truth. While Ralph continued to list specifications for permanent solutions, Michael remained silent until the air in the shop grew heavy with the smell of oil and old secrets. He uttered a single sentence that shattered the professional silence. "Your problem isn't the car, Betty. It never was." The theme, shifting the narrative in that moment, the Mustang became irrelevant. The story stopped being about mechanical adaptations and started being about the useful fear that had kept her sitting down long after her body was ready to stand. Michael wasn't just refusing a job, he was refusing to believe the lie she had been told to tell about herself. Before we continue, welcome to Brittany Stories. This is the home of powerful, emotional, and unforgettable stories, filled with drama, secrets, unexpected twists, and life-changing moments. Each story is crafted to entertain, inspire, and keep you thinking long after the video ends. If you love shocking reveals, hidden identities, billionaire secrets, and stories that touch the heart, you're in the right place. Like our videos if they move you, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Ralph's voice filled the shop the way expensive cologne fills a small room, impossible to ignore, vaguely suffocating. He had produced a leather portfolio from his briefcase, spreading technical diagrams across Michael's workbench like a general deploying battle plans. Hand controls with haptic feedback. Adaptive steering with neural response technology. A custom center console that would cost more than most people earned in a year. "I want the best," Ralph said, not asked. "Money is no object. I've researched your work, Mr. Ludlow. You have a reputation for solving impossible problems." Michael stood with his arms crossed, his blue flat cap casting shadows across a face that had learned to read people the way others read manuals. He hadn't touched the diagrams. Hadn't even glanced at them. His attention remained fixed on Betty, who sat near the Mustang with her hands folded in her lap, as still and composed as a painting in a museum. Something beautiful that people looked at but never truly saw. "I appreciate you coming all this way," Michael said finally, his voice low and deliberate. "But I can't help you." The shop seemed to hold its breath. Even the ambient hum of the ventilation system felt like it had paused mid-cycle. Ralph's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to the particular irritation of a man unaccustomed to rejection. "Excuse me. Did you hear what I'm offering? This is a 6-figure contract for a single vehicle modification." "I heard you fine. Then what's the problem? Is it the timeline? We can be flexible. Is it the specifications? We can adjust." "The problem," Michael interrupted, turning his gaze from Betty to Ralph for the first time, "is that you're trying to solve the wrong thing." Ralph's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to give her independence. I'm trying to give her freedom." "No," Michael said quietly. "You're trying to make yourself feel better about giving up." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the tension that had been building since they arrived. Betty's hands, which had been perfectly still, twitched slightly. Her eyes lifted from the oil-stained concrete to meet Michael's gaze, and for a moment, something flickered there. Recognition, perhaps, or fear, or the dangerous ember of hope that had been smothered for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to burn. "How dare you?" Ralph began, but Michael raised a hand. "I'm not trying to offend you, Mr. Jenkins. But adapting that car won't solve her problem." He looked directly at Betty now, and his voice carried a gentleness that somehow made the words more devastating. "Your problem isn't the car, ma'am. It never was." Betty's breath caught. The blue scarf at her throat rose and fell with the rhythm of someone trying very hard not to feel something that had already begun to surface. Ralph stepped between them, protective and furious. "We're leaving." This was clearly a mistake. But Betty didn't move. She sat there in her wheelchair, staring at the mechanic in the blue flat cap who had just refused a fortune to tell her a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "What is my problem then?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's expression softened. "That's what I'd like to find out." Ralph insisted they leave immediately, but Betty's wheelchair hadn't moved. Something in Michael's question had lodged itself beneath her ribs, uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. Ralph stood by the Mustang with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in clipped tones to someone about unprofessional conduct and wasted time, but his voice had become background noise, like traffic on a distant highway. Michael pulled up a metal stool that squeaked against the concrete and sat down so that his eyes were level with hers. It was such a small gesture, sitting rather than standing over her, but Betty couldn't remember the last time someone had done it. Most people either towered above her in conversations that felt like interrogations, or crouched with exaggerated sympathy that made her feel like a child. "Can I ask you something?" Michael said, his voice carrying none of the clinical detachment she'd grown accustomed to from doctors, and none of the careful pity she'd learned to expect from everyone else. Betty's fingers tightened on the armrests of her chair. "You're going to anyway." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Fair enough." He paused, studying her with that same unsettling attention from before. "Since when can't you move your legs?" "The accident was 7 years ago," she answered automatically, the rehearsed response that always ended these conversations before they could go anywhere uncomfortable. "The doctors said." "That's not what I asked." The interruption was gentle but firm, like a hand catching something mid-fall. Betty blinked, thrown off the script she'd memorized for every medical consultation, every well-meaning stranger, every physical therapist who had eventually stopped suggesting she try. "I asked since when you can't move them," Michael repeated. "Not since when you stopped trying." The distinction felt like a fissure opening in bedrock. Betty's breath went shallow. "That's the same thing." "Is it?" Ralph had finished his call and was striding back toward them, but Michael didn't break eye contact. Betty felt something rising in her chest, anger, maybe, or the dangerous cousin of anger that grief becomes when you've been carrying it too long. "The doctors ran every test," she said, her voice harder now, defensive. "MRIs, nerve conduction studies, everything. They said the damage was permanent. They said I needed to accept." "I'm not asking what the doctors said." Michael's tone remained even, maddeningly calm. "I'm asking what you know. In your body. Not in your head, not in their reports. What do you actually feel?" Betty's throat tightened. The question was absurd. Cruel, even. What did she feel? She felt nothing. That was the point. That was the entire goddamn point of 7 years in this chair. Except that wasn't entirely true, was it? There were moments, rare, fleeting, always dismissed, when she thought she felt something. Phantom sensations, her neurologist had called them. Meaningless electrical noise from damaged pathways. She had learned not to mention them because they led nowhere except to false hope, and false hope was the cruelest thing medicine could offer. "Ralph," she said quietly, still looking at Michael, "give us a minute." "Betty, this man is wasting our time." "Ralph." The sharpness in her voice surprised even herself. "Please." He stood there for 3 long seconds, jaw working, before he walked back toward the Mustang and leaned against it with his arms crossed, radiating disapproval. Michael waited. The shop was quiet except for the distant tick of cooling metal and the ambient whisper of air through open bay doors. "After the accident," Betty finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "did anyone ever actually ask me to stand up?" Michael's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes acknowledged the weight of what she'd just admitted. "No," he said simply. "I don't think they did." Michael stood and walked to a battered toolbox in the corner of the shop, the kind that had seen decades of use and carried the dents and scratches to prove it. He opened the top drawer and retrieved something small, closing his fingers around it before turning back to Betty. The gesture was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though he'd been waiting years for this particular moment. "I need to tell you something," he said, returning to the stool. "And you're going to think it's strange that I didn't say anything earlier." Betty's pulse quickened. There was something in his voice now, a weight that hadn't been there before. Ralph had pushed off from the Mustang and was watching them again, his protective instincts clearly overriding his frustration. Michael opened his hand. Resting in his palm was a small red pendant on a tarnished silver chain, the kind of inexpensive jewelry that holds value only because of who gave it or what it meant. The enamel had chipped in places, and the chain had a small break that someone had tried to repair with a clumsy knot. Betty's breath stopped entirely. "I was driving home that night," Michael said quietly. 7 years ago. The rain was coming down so hard I almost didn't see your car in the ditch. I pulled over, called 911, and waited with you until they arrived." The shop seemed to tilt slightly. Betty gripped her armrests, her knuckles white against the black padding. She had fragmented memories of that night, the sound of metal shrieking, the taste of blood, the sensation of being trapped and then suddenly free. But she didn't remember faces. The doctors said that was normal, that trauma erased details to protect you from reliving them. "You were conscious," Michael continued, his voice steady but gentle. "Hurt, but conscious. And before the paramedics got there, you were trying to get out. Trying to stand." "No," Betty whispered, but the word had no conviction behind it. "You made it to your knees before they stopped you. Told you not to move, that you could make it worse. They were right to say it, you had a spinal injury, moving could have been catastrophic. But you were trying." He held out the pendant. "This broke off when they loaded you into the ambulance. I kept it because I thought someone would come back for it. But no one ever did." Betty stared at the pendant, her vision blurring. She knew this necklace. Her mother had given it to her on her 16th birthday, a small thing from a department store that meant everything because it was the last birthday they'd celebrated together before the cancer took her. Betty had worn it every day for years until she woke up in a hospital bed and it was gone. She'd asked about it once, maybe twice, but in the chaos of surgeries and rehabilitation and learning to live in a chair, a lost necklace had seemed like the smallest of casualties. "I tried to stand," she said, the words tasting strange in her mouth, like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. "You did more than try," Michael said. "You were standing. On your knees, but standing. Your body was moving. But the doctors said." "I know what they said. And they were probably right about the immediate danger. But that was 7 years ago, Betty. The question isn't what your body couldn't do that night. The question is what it can do now, and whether anyone's bothered to ask." He placed the pendant in her lap, the small weight of it feeling impossibly heavy. Ralph's voice cut through the moment. "This is manipulation. You're giving her false hope." "I'm giving her a memory," Michael said, his tone sharpening for the first time. "One she deserves to have." Betty picked up the pendant with trembling fingers, the red enamel catching the light from the shop's fluorescent fixtures. And in that moment, holding this small piece of who she used to be, she felt something she hadn't felt in 7 years. She felt like she had permission to try. The pendant lay in Betty's palm like a question she'd been avoiding for 7 years. Michael stood and moved back to his workbench, giving her space to absorb what he'd just revealed. Ralph remained by the Mustang, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger, but for once he seemed uncertain about how to proceed. The script he'd prepared for this visit, wealthy benefactor solving problems with money, had been torn up and scattered across the shop floor. Betty closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling the uneven edges where the enamel had chipped. Her throat felt tight, her chest constricted in a way that had nothing to do with her spine and everything to do with grief she'd thought she'd finished processing years ago. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "You give me back my necklace and tell me to go home and think positive thoughts?" Michael turned from the workbench, and there was no pity in his expression, no motivational brightness that would have made her want to leave immediately. Instead, he looked at her with the same assessing gaze a mechanic might give a car, not to condemn it, but to understand what it was actually capable of. "No," he said. "I'm telling you I won't adapt a life that can still move." Ralph pushed off from the Mustang. "Enough. Betty, we're leaving. This man is not a doctor, he's not qualified to make medical judgments, and he's clearly more interested in playing savior than actually helping you." But Betty wasn't looking at Ralph. She was looking at Michael, trying to decode what he meant by, "can still move." It sounded absurd. She'd had the best specialists in the country examine her. She'd done months of physical therapy until even the therapists agreed they'd reached the limit of what was possible. She'd accepted her chair the way you accept gravity, as an immutable fact of existence. "What are you asking me to do?" Betty said. "Come back tomorrow," Michael replied. "Without the car. Without him." He nodded toward Ralph without breaking eye contact with her. "Come back and let's see if your body remembers what your mind has been trying to forget." "This is insane," Ralph said, his voice rising. "You're not a physical therapist. You're not a neurologist. You work on cars." "I work on things people have given up on," Michael corrected. "And I'm pretty good at figuring out the difference between something that's actually broken and something that's just been sitting too long in one position." Betty felt heat rising to her cheeks, anger mixing with something that might have been hope or might have been terror. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. "And if you're wrong? If I come back here and waste my time trying to feel something that isn't there?" "Then you'll know," Michael said simply. "And knowing is better than spending the rest of your life wondering." The words hung in the air between them, honest and uncomfortably direct. Betty looked down at the pendant in her hand, then at her legs beneath the pressed fabric of her skirt, legs that had become more like furniture than body parts, present but fundamentally separate from her sense of self. Ralph was saying something about lawsuits and liability, his phone already out to call their car service, but Betty barely heard him. She was thinking about that night 7 years ago, about kneeling in the rain with her body screaming in pain but responding, about the moment when someone told her to stop moving and she'd obeyed so completely she'd never tried again. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, the word feeling like stepping off a cliff. "I'll come back tomorrow." Michael nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than celebration. "Good. And Betty?" She looked up. "Leave the wheelchair in the car." Betty arrived the next morning in a town car, alone. The driver had looked uncertain when she'd asked him to help her to the shop's entrance using a walker she'd found buried in her garage, a relic from early rehabilitation that she'd kept for reasons she couldn't articulate. Ralph had called 3 times during the drive, each message escalating from concern to anger to something that sounded like grief. She hadn't answered. Michael was waiting by the open bay door, wearing the same gray flat cap and a different sweater, this one a faded navy blue that matched the morning sky. He watched her approach with the walker, each step a negotiation between her arms bearing weight and her legs remembering how to accept it. It took her nearly 5 minutes to cross 20 feet of parking lot, and by the time she reached the entrance, sweat had gathered at her temples despite the cool air. "Good," Michael said, and the single word carried more approval than 1,000 empty compliments. He gestured to a wooden chair he'd positioned in the center of the shop floor, sturdy and backless. "Have a seat." Betty maneuvered herself onto the chair, her arms trembling from the effort of the walk. The red pendant hung around her neck now, resting against her collarbone, a small weight that felt like an anchor to something she'd lost. Michael pulled up his metal stool and sat facing her, close enough that their knees almost touched. "I want you to try something," he said. "And it's going to sound strange. Stranger than leaving my wheelchair in a car and using a walker I haven't touched in 6 years?" Betty's voice carried an edge of exhaustion and dark humor. A faint smile crossed his face. "Fair point." He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "I want you to stop thinking about walking." Betty blinked. "That's why I'm here." "No. You're here to remember what feeling is like." He paused, letting the distinction settle. Walking is a goal. It's an outcome. It's something your brain has decided is impossible, so every time you think about it, you're reinforcing the story that you can't. But feeling, that's immediate. That's just paying attention to what's already there. "I don't feel anything," Betty said, the automatic response she'd given doctors and therapists for years. "Then let's test that." Michael's voice remained calm, unmoved by her defensiveness. "Close your eyes." Betty hesitated, then complied. The shop sounds became more pronounced. The distant hum of a compressor, the tick of metal expanding in morning heat, the faint whisper of wind through the open bay. "I want you to think about your right foot," Michael said. "Not move it. Just think about it. Imagine it's there, even if you can't feel it. Picture the weight of your shoe, the way your toes would feel pressed against the leather. Betty focused, searching for sensation in a landscape she'd learned to ignore. For several seconds, there was nothing, the familiar absence she'd grown accustomed to, the blank space where her lower body used to exist. But then, so faint she almost dismissed it as imagination, she felt something. Not movement. Not even sensation exactly. Just a kind of awareness, like when you know someone is standing behind you even though you can't see them. Theirs. She trailed off, afraid to name it. Don't interpret it, Michael said quickly. Don't decide what it means. Just notice it. Can you feel it again? Betty concentrated, chasing the ghost of awareness. And this time, unmistakably, she felt pressure. The weight of her foot against the floor. It was distant, muffled, like hearing music through a thick wall, but it was there. Her eyes flew open. I felt it. Michael nodded slowly. Good. Now forget about walking. Tomorrow we'll see if you can feel it again. That's it. Betty's voice carried both relief and frustration. We're done. For today. He stood, offering his hand to help her up. Feeling isn't something you force. It's something you remember. And remembering takes time. Betty accepted his hand, pulling herself upright with the walker. The sensation in her foot was already fading, slipping back into the numbness she knew so well. But it had been there. For just a moment, impossibly, it had been there. As she made her slow journey back to the town car, the pendant swung gently against her chest, and Betty realized she was crying. Not from sadness, but from the terrifying possibility that her body might not be the closed case everyone had declared it to be. Dr. Catherine Reeves arrived at Betty's penthouse the following afternoon with Ralph and a leather folder thick with medical records. Betty had been expecting this confrontation since she'd ignored Ralph's calls, but seeing her neurologist's carefully composed expression, the one reserved for delivering bad news to families, made her stomach tighten with familiar dread. They sat in her living room, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, expensive furniture arranged with the precision of a showroom. Ralph paced near the windows while Dr. Reeves settled into the chair across from Betty, the folder unopened on her lap like evidence waiting to be presented. Betty, Dr. Reeves began, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who'd spent years learning how to soften devastating truths. Ralph called me because he's concerned. And after hearing what's been happening, I share that concern. Betty sat in her wheelchair, she'd retrieved it from the car after returning home, and felt the familiar weight of medical authority pressing down on her. I felt something yesterday, she said, hating how defensive she sounded. In my foot. Pressure. Awareness. Dr. Reeves nodded with the patient tolerance of someone listening to a child describe an imaginary friend. Phantom sensations are incredibly common in spinal cord injuries. We've discussed this before. The brain creates false signals to compensate for missing input. It's a neurological illusion, not evidence of recovery. But what if it's not? Betty's fingers gripped the pendant beneath her blouse. What if there's something we missed? There's nothing we missed. Dr. Reeves finally opened the folder, pulling out sheets filled with imaging results and nerve conduction studies, the accumulated documentation of 7 years spent proving Betty's body was broken. Your injury was severe and permanent. The damage to your spinal cord was extensive. We've had this conversation multiple times, and the answer hasn't changed because the anatomy hasn't changed. Ralph stopped pacing and turned toward them, his face flushed with emotion. This mechanic is giving you false hope, Betty. He's not qualified to make medical judgments. He's a man who fixes cars, not people. He was there the night of the accident, Betty said quietly. He saw me try to stand. You were in shock, Dr. Reeves interjected smoothly. Adrenaline can temporarily override pain signals and create the illusion of mobility. What you experienced that night has no bearing on your current condition. Then why did no one ask me to try again? The question came out sharper than Betty intended. After the swelling went down, after the surgeries, after the rehabilitation, Why did everyone just accept that I couldn't move? Dr. Reeves's expression shifted to something closer to pity. Because pushing you to attempt something neurologically impossible would have been cruel. We were protecting you from unnecessary suffering. Or protecting yourselves from uncertainty, Betty said, surprising herself with the words. The room went silent. Ralph looked stricken, as though she'd accused him of abandonment rather than excessive care. Dr. Reeves closed the folder with deliberate precision, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its practiced softness. What this man is doing is dangerous, Betty. He's exploiting your vulnerability and your grief. He's convincing you that years of medical expertise can be overridden by wishful thinking. And when you inevitably discover that nothing has changed, the psychological damage could be devastating. She leaned forward. I've seen this before. Patients who refuse to accept their limitations, who chase miracle cures and alternative treatments, who waste years and fortunes on false promises. It never ends well. So you want me to stop, Betty said flatly. I want you to protect yourself, Dr. Reeves replied. Accept what is. Find peace in what you have. You've built a beautiful life within your limitations. Don't let desperation destroy that. Ralph moved to sit beside Betty's wheelchair, reaching for her hand. Please, he said, his voice breaking slightly. I can't watch you get hurt again. The accident nearly killed you. This hope might finish what the crash started. Betty looked at them both, the doctor with her evidence, Ralph with his grief, and felt the familiar pull toward compliance, toward the safety of a story everyone had agreed was true. But beneath her blouse, the red pendant rested against her skin, a small weight that reminded her of a different night when she tried to stand and someone had stopped her. I'm going back tomorrow, she said quietly. Dr. Reeves stood, collecting her folder with movements that radiated professional disappointment. Then I can't be responsible for what happens next. Ralph's hand withdrew from hers, and the silence that followed felt like a door closing. Betty woke at dawn and dressed herself slowly, methodically, the way she'd learned to do everything in the years since the accident. Black trousers. A simple white blouse. The red pendant, which she hadn't removed since Michael returned it. She left a note for Ralph on the kitchen counter, just 3 words, I'm going out, knowing he wouldn't read it until after his morning calls to the investors in Tokyo. The town car driver said nothing when she asked him to take her to the shop, though his eyes lingered on the walker she'd brought instead of her wheelchair. Perhaps he'd been instructed not to question her choices anymore, or perhaps he simply understood that some decisions couldn't be argued with. Michael was already working when she arrived, bent over the engine of a vintage Chevrolet with the kind of focused attention that made the rest of the world disappear. He looked up as she approached with the walker, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged her presence without making it into something triumphant or pathetic. Just, you're here, that's good. They came to see me yesterday, Betty said, lowering herself onto the wooden chair that had become hers. My doctor, Ralph. They brought medical records and logic and genuine concern for my well-being. Michael pulled up his stool, patient and unhurried. What did they say? That you're dangerous. That I'm chasing false hope. That the kindest thing I can do for myself is accept what is and stop reaching for what isn't. Betty paused, her fingers finding the pendant. They're not wrong about some of it. You're not a doctor. You can't promise me anything. And statistically, they're probably right. Probably, Michael agreed. But here's what I realized lying awake last night, Betty continued, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. I've been functional for 7 years. I have money, freedom, independence, all the things people say matter. I've adapted. I've accepted. I've built a life that works within the boundaries everyone agreed were permanent. She looked directly at him. And none of it has ever felt complete. The words hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Michael said nothing, letting the truth settle the way dust settles after something heavy has been moved. Ralph loves me, Betty said. I know that. And my doctors genuinely believe they're protecting me. but they're all so focused on preventing me from falling that no one ever considered I might want to stand, even if standing means risking everything I've carefully constructed. Functional isn't the same as whole, Michael said quietly. No. Betty felt something loosening in her chest, a knot she'd been carrying for so long she'd forgotten it was there. No, it's not. Michael stood and moved to a clear space in the shop floor. Come here, he said. Leave the walker. Betty's heart hammered against her ribs. Yesterday he'd asked her to feel. Today, the request felt larger, more dangerous. She gripped the arms of the chair, her body remembering every fall, every failure, every moment when trying had led to nothing but exhaustion and disappointment. But she also remembered kneeling in the rain 7 years ago, her body moving despite the pain. She remembered the pressure in her foot yesterday, distant but real. She remembered her mother's voice the day she'd given her the red pendant. Sometimes the smallest things remind us we're still here. Betty pushed herself up from the chair, hands trembling as she released her grip on safety. Michael moved closer but didn't touch her, his presence solid without being controlling. She took one unsteady step forward, then another, her legs shaking with the effort of bearing weight they hadn't supported in years. Her arms windmilled slightly, searching for balance, and for a terrifying moment she felt herself tilting. Michael's hand caught her elbow, not lifting but steadying, letting her find her own center of gravity. You're standing, he said simply. And she was. Not gracefully. Not without trembling or fear or the very real possibility of collapse. But standing nonetheless, her body remembering something her mind had tried to forget. Functional wasn't the same as complete. But complete meant risking everything she'd learned to accept. Betty looked at Michael through tears she didn't bother to hide. Again, she said. I want to try again. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that became sacred. Betty arrived each morning as the sun broke over the shop's weathered roof, and each morning Michael asked her to do something that felt impossible until it wasn't. Stand for 10 seconds. Shift her weight from left to right. Feel the difference between muscle tension and muscle memory. Progress measured not in miracles but in millimeters, in the gradual awakening of pathways everyone had declared permanently severed. Ralph stopped calling after the first week. Dr. Reeves sent a formal letter withdrawing as Betty's primary neurologist, citing ethical concerns and recommending she seek psychiatric evaluation. Betty read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer she never opened again. On a Thursday morning gray with the promise of rain, Betty stood in the center of the shop without support for the first time. Michael had moved the walker across the room, then the chair, creating empty space around her that felt both liberating and terrifying. Her legs trembled with the sustained effort of bearing her full weight, her arms held slightly away from her body for balance. How long has it been? She asked, her voice tight with concentration. Michael glanced at his watch. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. 2 minutes. She'd been standing for 2 minutes. A distance that seemed both impossibly long and heartbreakingly short. Her calves burned with the kind of pain that meant muscles were working, actually working, after years of carefully managed atrophy. I can't, she started, and then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of sensation, no cinematic moment of sudden healing. Instead, it was as though a circuit that had been disconnected for years suddenly found its pathway again. Betty felt her right quadricep engage, not as a phantom sensation, not as wishful imagination, but as real, undeniable tension. The muscle contracted, held, responded to her intention to remain upright. Michael. His name came out as barely a whisper. I see it, he said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Not triumph, but a kind of quiet witnessing, as though he'd been waiting years for this specific moment. Betty's left leg followed, the sensation spreading like heat through frozen limbs. Tension. Life. The unmistakable feedback of muscles doing what muscles were designed to do. She felt her weight distribute more evenly, felt her body make micro-adjustments to maintain balance without her conscious command. It was terrifying and overwhelming and more real than anything she'd experienced since the night of the accident. I feel them, she said, and the words broke something open inside her chest. Michael, I can feel my legs. Her vision blurred with tears that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with grief, for the years she'd spent sitting, for the life she'd accepted as complete when it was only functional, for the version of herself she'd buried because everyone agreed she'd never get her back. The emotion surged through her with the force of something too long suppressed, and her legs buckled. Michael was there before she hit the ground, catching her under the arms and lowering her gently to the concrete floor. She sat there gasping, her hands pressed against her thighs, feeling the tension still humming beneath her skin like electricity through a wire that had finally been reconnected. "They're alive," she whispered, her fingers digging into the fabric of her trousers as though she could hold onto the sensation through sheer force of will. "My legs are alive." Michael crouched beside her, his gray flat cap shadowing his eyes but not the slight smile at the corner of his mouth. "They always were," he said quietly. "You just needed someone to stop telling you they weren't." Betty looked up at him through tear-blurred vision, and for the first time in 7 years she felt the full weight of what she'd lost. Not to the accident, but to the well-meaning voices that had convinced her losing was the only option. The grief was crushing and liberating in equal measure, because grief meant there was something worth mourning, which meant there was something worth fighting to reclaim. "I want to stand again," she said, her voice raw but steady. Michael offered his hand. "Then let's see if you can." 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that became sacred. Betty arrived each morning as the sun broke over the shop's weathered roof, and each morning Michael asked her to do something that felt impossible until it wasn't. Stand for 10 seconds. Shift her weight from left to right. Feel the difference between muscle tension and muscle memory. Progress measured not in miracles but in millimeters, in the gradual awakening of pathways everyone had declared permanently severed. Ralph stopped calling after the first week. Dr. Reeves sent a formal letter withdrawing as Betty's primary neurologist, citing ethical concerns and recommending she seek psychiatric evaluation. Betty read the letter once, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer she never opened again. On a Thursday morning gray with the promise of rain, Betty stood in the center of the shop without support for the first time. Michael had moved the walker across the room, then the chair, creating empty space around her that felt both liberating and terrifying. Her legs trembled with the sustained effort of bearing her full weight, her arms held slightly away from her body for balance. "How long has it been?" she asked, her voice tight with concentration. Michael glanced at his watch. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. 2 minutes. She'd been standing for 2 minutes. A distance that seemed both impossibly long and heartbreakingly short. Her calves burned with the kind of pain that meant muscles were working, actually working, after years of carefully managed atrophy. "I can't," she started, and then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no surge of sensation, no cinematic moment of sudden healing. Instead, it was as though a circuit that had been disconnected for years suddenly found its pathway again. Betty felt her right quadricep engage, not as a phantom sensation, not as wishful imagination, but as real, undeniable tension. The muscle contracted, held, responded to her intention to remain upright. "Michael." His name came out as barely a whisper. "I see it," he said, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Not triumph, but a kind of quiet witnessing, as though he'd been waiting years for this specific moment. Betty's left leg followed, the sensation spreading like heat through frozen limbs. Tension. Life. The unmistakable feedback of muscles doing what muscles were designed to do. She felt her weight distribute more evenly, felt her body make micro-adjustments to maintain balance without her conscious command. It was terrifying and overwhelming and more real than anything she'd experienced since the night of the accident. "I feel them," she said, and the words broke something open inside her chest. "Michael, I can feel my legs." Her vision blurred with tears that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with grief, for the years she'd spent sitting, for the life she'd accepted as complete when it was only functional, for the version of herself she'd buried because everyone agreed she'd never get her back. The emotion surged through her with the force of something too long suppressed, and her legs buckled. Michael was there before she hit the ground, catching her under the arms and lowering her gently to the concrete floor. She sat there gasping, her hands pressed against her thighs, feeling the tension still humming beneath her skin like electricity through a wire that had finally been reconnected. "They're alive," she whispered, her fingers digging into the fabric of her trousers as though she could hold onto the sensation through sheer force of will. "My legs are alive." Michael crouched beside her, his gray flat cap shadowing his eyes but not the slight smile at the corner of his mouth. "They always were," he said quietly. "You just needed someone to stop telling you they weren't." Betty looked up at him through tear-blurred vision, and for the first time in 7 years she felt the full weight of what she'd lost. Not to the accident, but to the well-meaning voices that had convinced her losing was the only option. The grief was crushing and liberating in equal measure, because grief meant there was something worth mourning, which meant there was something worth fighting to reclaim. "I want to stand again," she said, her voice raw but steady. Michael offered his hand. "Then let's see if you can." 6 weeks after Betty first felt tension return to her legs, she walked into the shop without assistance. Not gracefully. Her gait was uneven, her steps deliberate and carefully measured, one hand occasionally reaching for a wall or workbench when her balance wavered. But she walked. The walker remained in the town car, a prop from a story she was learning to rewrite. Michael looked up from the Mustang GT's engine, which he'd been tuning to perfection during the weeks Betty had been discovering what her body could still do. The car gleamed in the morning light, its silver paint reflecting the shop's fluorescent fixtures, still unmodified, still waiting. "I need to show you something," Betty said, her voice carrying none of the careful politeness from that first visit. She sounded different now, steadier, grounded in a way that came from trusting her own body rather than accommodating its supposed limitations. Michael set down his wrench and watched as Betty walked the length of the shop floor. 20 feet. 40. She completed a circuit around the Mustang, her hand trailing along its hood not for support but for connection, feeling the cool metal beneath her palm. When she returned to where Michael stood, her breathing was elevated but controlled, her legs trembling slightly but holding. "The doctors were wrong," she said simply. "No." Michael shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "The doctors were looking at pictures of what happened 7 years ago. They weren't wrong about the injury. They were wrong about the story." Betty understood the distinction. The damage had been real. The pain had been real. The initial paralysis had been medically accurate. But somewhere between diagnosis and prognosis, between what was true in that moment and what would always be true, the story had calcified into permanence. Everyone had agreed she was broken, and in agreeing, they'd made it so. "I spent 7 years believing I was complete," Betty said, leaning against the Mustang's fender. "I had everything money could buy. Adaptive technology. Personal assistance. A life that functioned perfectly within the boundaries I'd accepted. Ralph made sure I never wanted for anything. Except the chance to want," Michael offered quietly. "Yes." The word came out as a breath. "He loved me so much he protected me from trying. And I let him, because trying meant risking the discovery that I really was as broken as everyone said." Michael walked to his workbench and retrieved something wrapped in cloth. When he unfolded it, Betty saw her car keys resting in his palm, polished and gleaming. "The car's ready," he said. "Engine's tuned. Everything's perfect. No modifications." Betty took the keys, their weight familiar and strange all at once. She looked at the Mustang GT, the car she'd brought here asking for adaptations that would cement her limitations into steel and leather. Now it sat before her, unchanged and perfect, waiting for a driver who had changed everything. "I don't think I'm ready to drive it yet," she admitted. "Not safely." "That's okay." Michael smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "It'll be here when you are." Betty nodded, pocketing the keys. She turned toward the shop entrance where sunlight streamed through the open bay door, painting the oil-stained concrete in shades of gold. The walk to the town car would take 5 minutes, maybe more. Her legs would ache. She might stumble. She would probably need to rest halfway. She took the first step anyway. "Betty," Michael called as she reached the threshold. She turned back, sunlight framing her silhouette. When you do drive it again, he said, don't think about where you've been. Think about where you're going. Betty felt the red pendant rest against her chest, a small weight that reminded her that some stories aren't finished when everyone agrees they're over. Some stories just need someone willing to ask the right question. Not whether you can walk, but whether anyone ever asked you to try. She walked out of the shop into the morning light, each step an argument against permanence, each movement proof that when a story is corrected, everything can change. Behind her, the Mustang waited. Not as a symbol of limitation, but as a promise she'd made to herself about the woman she'd decided to become again. The functional life was over. The complete one was just beginning. Thank you for watching Brittany Stories. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories you won't forget. And please leave a comment, I would love to hear from you.